The morning began like any other. The light coming through the kitchen window was soft and kind, the kind of light that usually promises peace. But that day it felt different. The air was too still, too quiet, almost like the house was holding its breath. I had set the table for two, as I always did when my son came home. It was silly maybe, but it made me feel useful, needed. It had been weeks since I'd seen him. He said work kept him busy, but a mother always knows when distance means more than just work. When I finally heard his footsteps, my heart lifted for a moment. He looked tired, but there was something else in his eyes, a kind of nervousness I hadn't seen before. He smiled the way people smile when they're hiding something. And without thinking, I asked the question that had been waiting quietly in the back of my mind for months. The one question that changed everything. I asked him when he was planning to get married. The silence that followed felt sharp, like the air had cut in half. In that single heartbeat, I saw guilt flicker across his face. Before I could say another word, I heard the sound of heels on the floor. Steady, confident, unfamiliar. And then I saw her. A woman in red, standing at the doorway of my home like she'd owned it all along. Her presence filled the room before her words did. And in that calm, almost careless tone, she said something I'll never forget. She said they had already gotten married. Last night. Just like that. She even smiled as she said it, the kind of smile that doesn't need kindness to exist. She mentioned that it was a small ceremony, and that only special people were invited. Special people. The world seemed to stop moving. I didn't react right away. I couldn't. It was as if my body had forgotten what breathing felt like. I looked at my son, and in that single glance I realized I had already lost him. Not to death, not to distance, but to someone else's control. And the cruelest part was, he looked relieved that she had said it for him. The room around me felt different suddenly. The walls that once held my laughter now echoed someone else's footsteps. Even the morning light felt foreign, like it no longer belonged to this house. I stood there, frozen between past and present, trying to make sense of it all. Yesterday I had a son I thought I knew. Today, I was standing in front of a stranger who carried his last name. I didn't cry. Not then. Tears would have given her too much power. Instead, I did what mothers do best. I stayed quiet and I watched. Because sometimes silence holds more strength than any scream ever could. That night, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt too big for just one heartbeat. I could almost hear the echo of the child he once was, running through these very halls, calling for me, laughing without guilt. And I wondered when exactly that boy had disappeared. As I sat there, the clock ticked softly, reminding me of all the hours I'd spent waiting for him through the years, waiting for his calls, his visits, his promises. And yet, last night while I was still waiting, he was somewhere else, saying vows to another woman without a single thought for me. I tried to tell myself it was fine, that maybe this is what love looks like, people moving on, creating their own families. But deep inside I knew this wasn't love. This was erasure. When I closed my eyes, I saw his wedding happening in silence. The lights, the laughter, the faces I didn't know. And I could almost hear her voice saying, only special people were invited. Those words kept repeating in my head like a cruel lullaby. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I walked through the house and touched the walls, the photographs, the old curtains. All the little things that still carried pieces of me. They were the only ones left who remembered. By morning I wasn't angry. Anger burns too fast. What I felt was heavier, something like grief. Because that day I didn't just lose my son's truth. I lost my place in his world. And deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The first morning after they moved and felt wrong from the start. I woke early, the way I always do, but the house already smelled different, too much perfume, not enough coffee. There was music playing somewhere down the hall, loud and careless, like it belonged in another life. I stood by the kitchen door and listened to the sounds of my own home, and not one of them felt familiar. She was already awake, moving through the kitchen like she'd owned it for years. Cabinets opened and closed, drawers scraped, dishes clattered in a rhythm that didn't belong to me. The clock above the stove ticked louder than usual, almost as if it, too, disapproved. I kept thinking that maybe she'd turn, smile, and ask me how I liked my tea. But she didn't. She never asked. She never needed to. That morning, I realized something about people who take control. They never announce it. They simply start acting as if they already have it. Every day after that, something small changed. The old curtains disappeared first, replaced by lighter ones that matched her style. Then the family photographs on the wall began to vanish, one by one. leaving pale squares where sunlight used to rest. Even the kitchen towels were replaced. Little things, but little things are what make a home. Soon the furniture was moved. The couch that once faced the window now faced the television. The plants I'd cared for were pushed outside for more light, she said, though she never asked if I agreed. My son didn't notice. Or maybe he did and didn't want to see it. Love can blind people in gentle ways. He walked through the rooms with her hand in his, smiling, proud of their new beginning. And I stood in the background, smiling too, pretending it didn't feel like an ending for me. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of the house shifted entirely. She decided the mealtimes, the guests, even the grocery lists. She handled everything with confidence, and my presence slowly became unnecessary. Like old wallpaper still clinging to a newly painted wall. I stopped cooking breakfast. I told myself it was because she liked doing it, but really it was because my hands no longer felt welcome around my own stove. Sometimes I would sit by the window and listen to them laughing together. Her laughter was sharp. It cut through the air like glass. His was softer, the same laugh he used to give me when he was little, only now it belonged to someone else. The evenings were the hardest. That was when the house used to feel alive. When dinner smelled of garlic and fresh bread. When voices overlapped. When life filled every corner. Now the house spoke in whispers. Footsteps. Doors closing. The faint hum of the dishwasher. Nothing else. She brought friends over sometimes. They were loud, confident, always dressed beautifully. They filled the living room with laughter that didn't include me. I would stay upstairs, listening to their voices rise and fall like waves I was no longer allowed to swim in. Once I heard her say to someone almost proudly, "This place needed a woman's touch." I smiled bitterly. Apparently all my years here didn't count as that. I began to spend more time in my garden. Among the flowers I could still recognize myself. The soil didn't care about status or control. It just needed patience, the same kind I'd been forced to learn. In the afternoons when the sun was soft, I'd sit there with a cup of tea and remember how things used to be. How laughter once spilled out of the windows, how the gate creaked each time my son came home. Now even the creak was gone, she'd oiled it to stop the noise. It was a small change, but it made me feel like the house was forgetting me piece by piece. Some nights I walked through the hallway and touched the walls, hoping they would still feel warm. They didn't. Even the air felt different, too polished, too new, too foreign. I started talking less, doing less, existing less. It wasn't surrender exactly. It was self-preservation. When a person tries to erase you, the only thing left to do is make yourself harder to erase. So I hid in quietness. I became part of the furniture she couldn't quite throw away. I learned her rhythm. The way she arranged flowers that weren't real. The way she smiled at people only when they were watching. The way she avoided eye contact when my son mentioned the past. Control was her language and she spoke it fluently. But even control can't change history. At night, when the house was dark and still, I would walk down the hall and open the drawer where I'd hidden the old photographs. I'd hold them under the lamplight. My husband, my son as a child, our small, imperfect family. The images were fading, but the memories refused to. I realized then that she could replace everything in this house. The curtains, the dishes, the furniture. But she couldn't replace the years. The years belonged to me. I began to whisper to the house sometimes, as if it were listening. I told it not to forget me. And maybe it heard, because one afternoon, when I walked past the old family portrait she had hidden behind a shelf, a sliver of sunlight slipped through the window and touched my face, as if the house itself was trying to say, "I still remember." That was the moment I stopped feeling invisible. Not powerful, not strong, just seen. By the walls, by the memories, by the truth that still lived here. And I knew then that this story wasn't over. The stranger might live in my house, but the house still belonged to me. Time moves differently when you live in silence. Days blur into one another like pages left out in the rain. All the words still there, but smudged and hard to read. That's how life began to feel for me. Familiar but unreadable. I stopped setting the table for 3. Stopped making tea at dawn. Stopped expecting footsteps on the stairs. Because now everything had an order, her order. And I had learned my place in it. Quiet, small background. But the thing about memories is, they don't wait for permission. They arrive when they want. They sit beside you even when you have nowhere left to sit. Sometimes while folding laundry that wasn't mine, I'd see my son's shirt, the same size now, but still somehow reminding me of the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap, crumbs of biscuits stuck to his lips. And for a second I'd forget everything, the woman, the house, the cold distance between us. For a second he was still my child. One afternoon, I was dusting the bookshelf, the one she said was too old-fashioned. And there it was, tucked behind a stack of modern decor books, my husband's pocket watch. The one he'd worn every single day of his life. I don't even remember hiding it there. I held it in my hand and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Belonging that I wound it once just to hear it tick. The sound filled the room, small but steady, like a heartbeat I'd almost forgotten. That sound brought everything back. The years of sacrifice. The laughter in this house before life got so complicated. The smell of fresh paint when we first built this home with nothing but love and borrowed hope. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of how everything changes, and how sometimes you have to lose control to remember who you are. Because power isn't in owning a house. It's in the stories that built it. The next morning I walked out to my garden again. The soil was dry, almost cracked, as if it had been waiting for me to return. I knelt down, pressed my fingers into the dirt, and whispered, "I'm still here." Maybe it was foolish, but it felt like the earth answered back. Soft wind, gentle rustling leaves, the same way my husband used to hum when words weren't enough. It was that morning I decided I wouldn't let her erase me. Not by arguing, not by fighting, but by existing. By being steady in a house that had forgotten how to love gently. So I began small. I brought back my teapot, the old one with tiny cracks and faded roses. I placed it right in the center of the kitchen counter. No words, no permission asked. It was just home. And for a few days she didn't say anything. But I noticed how her eyes paused on it every morning, the same way mine did. She hated it, not because it was ugly, but because it didn't belong to her story. Then came the day she moved it, put it away in a cabinet, replaced it with a brand new steel one. Shiny, empty, soulless. And I smiled because I realized something that day. She was trying to erase a history she could never rewrite. One evening, when my son came home later than usual, I heard them whispering in the living room. Her tone sharp, his softer, tired. I didn't hear the words, but I knew the sound of tension. It was the same sound that used to echo in this house years ago when bills were late and dreams were heavy. It was the sound of something cracking slowly. I wanted to go down there, to tell him that love built on control never lasts. But I didn't. I just stayed still like the walls, watching, waiting, knowing time always reveals truth. In the following days I noticed small changes again. This time not hers but his. He lingered around me longer. Asked small questions about old recipes, about my health, about the garden. Maybe he didn't realize it, but the way he spoke, it was softer. Like he was remembering who he used to be. One night I found him sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. He didn't say a word and I didn't ask. I just sat beside him like I used to when he was a boy afraid of thunder. And after a long silence, he whispered, "You never said anything, Mom." I smiled in the dark and said quietly, "Sometimes silence is the loudest way to speak." He didn't reply, but I could feel something shifting. A quiet understanding, a pull of conscience. Maybe he was finally hearing what I'd been saying all along without words. That night I slept better than I had in months. Because even though nothing had changed on the surface, the curtains, the furniture, the order of things, I knew that deep inside my story was beginning to breathe again. I had found my place not by fighting for it, but by refusing to disappear. And I knew that sooner or later, the truth, my truth, would find its voice again in this house. There comes a time when silence starts to echo back. When the walls you've kept your pain behind begin to whisper it back to you. That's when I knew something was about to change. It began on a Sunday. She was hosting a small gathering, her kind of gathering, shiny plates, sparkling glasses, laughter that didn't reach the eyes. The guest list was carefully chosen. People she admired, people who admired her. And I was not part of the plan. I stayed in my room, listening to the sound of forced happiness floating up the stairs. But the thing about houses like this, sound travels differently. You can always hear what you're not supposed to. Someone asked her, laughing, "So how's life with the in-laws?" And she said without hesitation, "It's fine. But we'll move soon. I like my space." They all laughed. And for the first time in a long while I didn't cry. I just sat there quietly, letting her words fill the room like smoke. Because smoke always finds its way out. It can't stay trapped forever. Later that evening she came upstairs pretending to check on me. Her smile was perfect, practiced. Her tone soft, too soft. I hope the noise didn't disturb you. I simply nodded. But in her eyes I saw something new, not confidence, not control. Fear. Fear always shows itself when someone starts realizing their power is slipping. The next morning I found her pacing the kitchen, phone in hand, whispering harshly to someone. She didn't see me standing there. Her voice was sharp, impatient. I told you not to call me at home. The words froze me. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, like she had two lives and this was the one she didn't want seen. She turned, saw me and smiled too quickly. Just a friend, she said. But the look in her eyes told another story. From that day on she became restless. She cleaned too much, talked too little and smiled too often. My son noticed. He didn't say it, but I could feel his questions building in the way he avoided eye contact. That week he invited his old friend, David, over for dinner. It was his idea, not hers. She tried to object, but he insisted. That night, for the first time in months, the house felt alive again. The smell of home-cooked food, the sound of real laughter, stories that didn't need polishing. She sat there, silent for most of it, forcing her smile whenever someone looked her way. But I could see it, the way her mask was cracking, one polite smile at a time. Halfway through dinner, David mentioned something. He said he'd seen her at a restaurant a few weeks ago, not with my son but with someone else. He said it casually, not knowing the weight of his words. The room went still. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. She laughed it off. Oh, just a colleague. But her hands trembled as she reached for her glass. My son didn't speak. He just looked at her, long and searching. And in that look I saw everything unravel. After the guests left, the silence in the house felt heavier than it had ever been. They argued quietly, doors closed, voices muffled. I didn't listen this time. I didn't need to. Sometimes you don't have to hear the words to know what they mean. Later my son came to me. His face was pale, tired, older somehow. He didn't ask for advice. He didn't need comfort. He just sat beside me, the same way he used to when life confused him as a child. And for the first time in a long while he took my hand. No words. Just a quiet understanding passing between us. The kind that only mothers and sons share when truth finally returns home. That night I stayed awake. The house felt different again. Not colder this time, lighter. Like it had been holding its breath for months and was finally allowed to exhale. I looked around at the walls, the photos, the small pieces of my life that she had tried to hide. And I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. Because I knew deep down that truth always finds its way back. It may take time, it may take pain, but it always comes home. And though I never raised my voice, never fought, never demanded anything, she had lost. Not because I wanted her to, but because she had built her place in this home on control, and I had built mine on love. And love, even when silent, never truly leaves. There's a strange silence that comes after a storm. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels clean. That's how the house felt the next morning. Still. Soft. Honest. I woke early, though I hadn't slept much. The air was different. Not heavy, not cold, just still, like it was waiting. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a guest in my own home. I felt like myself. I heard my son moving around downstairs. Slow footsteps, a drawer opening then closing. I knew that sound. He was packing. Not hers, his. When I came down, he was sitting at the table, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He looked tired, but there was something else in his face too, clarity. He didn't look like the boy I raised anymore. He looked like a man who had finally seen the truth. He didn't say what had happened between them. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence is confession enough. I sat across from him and for a moment it was just the two of us again. The way it used to be. He reached across the table and took my hand. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. Mom. I should have seen it sooner. I didn't answer. Some lessons don't need forgiveness. They just need understanding. He stayed quiet for a long time, then whispered, "She's leaving today." I nodded slowly. I didn't feel anger, not even satisfaction. Just a calm kind of sadness. The kind that comes from knowing life always finds a way to balance itself. When she came down, her eyes were swollen. Her voice softer than I had ever heard it. She didn't speak to me. Just walked past, suitcase in hand, perfume still filling the air. But as she reached the door, she stopped for a moment. Turned slightly, almost too quietly, and said, "I'm sorry. It wasn't much. But it was enough." After she left, the house felt hollow. Not broken, just echoing with everything that had been lost and learned. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, straightening frames, opening windows, letting the air move freely again. I found her new curtains still hanging in the living room. They were pretty light, but they didn't belong here. So I took them down and folded them neatly. Then I opened the old chest in the attic and found the ones my husband and I had chosen years ago. Faded now, but still carrying the warmth of the past. When I hung them back up, sunlight poured into the room. And for the first time, the house breathed again. My son started helping me around the house after that. He didn't talk much, but he stayed close. Sometimes he'd sit in the garden reading while I worked beside him. We didn't need to fill the silence. It was enough that he was there. One evening he asked, "Mom, how did you stay so calm through all this?" I smiled and looked toward the sky, painted in orange and gold. "Because I learned a long time ago," I said softly. "You can't control what others bring into your life, but you can decide what you let stay." He didn't reply, but I could see the understanding in his eyes, the kind that only comes from pain that finally makes sense. That night when I went to bed, I heard the house creak gently, the same sound it used to make when my husband walked down the hallway. And I smiled in the dark, because I knew I wasn't alone. Not really. This home, this life, these memories, they had been mine all along. And though time had taken so much, my husband, my peace, my son's innocence, it had given me something too. Strength. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't fight, doesn't need to win. Just survives. Now every morning when sunlight touches the kitchen floor, I make tea in my old cracked teapot, and I whisper to the walls, "We made it." Because in the end, it was never about revenge, or control, or who owned the house. It was about what remained after the storm, the truth, the love, and a mother's unshakable heart.